Hi everyone, my name is Sa'id Sbzian. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, focusing on democracy and emotions. My research is in affective aspects of power, manipulations, and discourse. I'm interested in cognitive rhetoric, political philosophy, and literary theory. So we have another presenter who will begin his lecture in a few minutes after I briefly explain the goals of these lectures and the intended audience for the lectures. We are providing a series of lectures in a few modules to introduce a critical theory called disability studies. Our goal is to teach audience how disability has been defined and approached across cultures, how disability has been represented in society, culture, education, arts, fiction, photography, and film. And we will explain disability studies with a special emphasis on human rights, social justice, social policy, and the responsibility of the individual and the critic. We will illustrate these through examples from across cultures, specifically from North America and Iran as a Middle Eastern country. So one question is, who is the audience for this series of lectures? We have provided these lectures, first of all, to introduce and explain a theoretical perspective on disability. But we intend a general audience who is interested in social and cultural issues. We also speak to the people with disabilities as well as able-bodied people about the meaning and significance of disability. Our audience could be any intellectual, writer, artist, or a student who is curious about human rights and democracy. Also, anyone who wants to know about the rights and lives of people with disabilities. Now it's Jay's turn to introduce himself and start talking about disability studies theoretically.
Hi there, my name is Jay Daalmij. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Waterloo. I got my PhD a long time ago at Miami University of Ohio in the United States. My work focuses on the connected rhetorical constructions of disability and race. I look at things like eugenics and immigration discourses to try and understand how disability has been used to limit the movement of bodies and to limit human rights over the course of history. I'm interested in rhetorical theory, history, composition, writing theory, and pedagogy, and most of all, disability studies, and I'm the current editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. So we're going to present a few different modules in this series with the hope of introducing disability studies to the audience that Sa'id explained. This first module is going to focus on trying to answer the question, what is disability studies? And we're going to come at that from a few different angles. One way to define disability studies is to say that it's a field of study. It's a coherent field of study, but it's interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. That means it brings in many different disciplines, and it's also a field that allows people to work across disciplines. Disability studies centers on the idea that disability is a political and a cultural identity and not simply a medical condition. That means that disability studies challenges the idea that disability is a deficit or a defect that should be cured or remedied, and disability studies disrupts the idea that an individual with disabilities can be defined solely through her or his disabilities. Disability studies also critiques representations of disability as pitiable, inviting charity, to be compensated for, made invisible, or overcome. So, although there are many different disabilities and many different communities of people with disabilities, and while perspectives on disability vary and are constantly contested, disability studies as an academic field does provide a somewhat unified stance on disability, and that could be cognitive, physical, learning, mental, emotional, psychological disability, and so on. There's common ground in disability studies based on the common experience of stigma, a historical experience of oppression, and of course, a history of fighting for more positive representations, a history of struggling for physical and intellectual access in places like the university. There are many different disabilities represented under the umbrella of disability studies. And of course, there are tensions created by this grouping. However, disability studies scholars often show how disability is itself represented as a catch-all. People with physical disabilities are assumed to be cognitively disabled, for instance, or representations of physical disability often rely on reinforcement from suggestions that those people with physical disabilities also have some mental or physical deficit or psychological deficit. Different groups are also united by the experience of stigma and oppression, as mentioned. For these reasons, and only contingently and carefully, disability studies often bundles learning disabilities and physical impairments together, for instance. In that way, creates a somewhat unified field. So next, Sa'id is going to talk about some different orientations or ways of looking at disability.
So Jay talked about the interdisciplinary nature of disability studies, that it is concerned with the identity of people with disabilities, that they should not be reduced to their impaired body parts. Jay also talked about the common concerns that become sources of contradiction in categorizing disability. Now, I want to explain what the sources of these contradictions are and how these originate different perspectives on disability. My purpose in explaining these orientations and perspectives is to focus on what we should learn from such studies, and then move on to where the democratic debates come into the picture. Different disciplines, cultures, individuals have disagreement on what disabilities are and how they should be explained. So pay attention here. There is a contradiction in defining disability, which systematically results in different lives for people with disability. This discrepancy in defining and categorizing disabilities lies in a few questions. The first question is this, a question of the nature of disability, that how we give meaning to disability. This leads into a related question. The second question would be something like this, how disability is seen and approached. And the third question is how disability functions in contemporary society. In other words, how do people with disabilities live in any society? Based on such questions, we find different orientations in disability studies. And through these perspectives, we can understand how people and societies respond to disabilities. So how do we see disability? There are several ways of how our perspectives on disability shape our thinking about disabilities. The first model is a medical model, or a medical perspective on disability. The second model is a tragedy or a charity way of looking at disability. A different model is a religious or moral perspective on disability. And the last one is a social perspective on disability. At this point in our lecture, I only explained the deficit model, which Jay pointed out, and then we move on to other perspectives. The deficit perspective evaluates human mental and physical characteristics along a continuum and categorizes people based on how they meet the criteria set by medical tests. This is specifically evident in education, where children's sight, height, health, weight, and IQs are measured. It is based on such measurements that a deficit model of mind and body shapes. This model is sometimes called biological inferiority or functional limitation model. Because the norming structure in the society and education is based on capacities of the able-bodied people, anyone with impairment would be considered lacking something or as abnormal. So in disability studies, we want to show how such abnormalities are, paradoxically, expressive of some form of lack in society rather than in the individual with disability. For example, if a wheelchair-using person has problem entering a building due to the structure of the floors, the steps, and any other barriers, the medical or deficit model does not engage itself with the architectural and managing questions. There are numerous examples for this model, and I just want to point out that in such occasions as city planning, educational programming, and any other state-related programs, disability as an experience needs to be given its right to define its experiences. People with disabilities also must be given their human rights to decide the way that the structures and institutions need to be built according to their needs. Here, at this point, I just want to give an introduction to authority and normativity, which Jay will explain in full detail. So what I want to emphasize is the discursive and rhetorical aspect of disability. And what do I mean when I say disability is rhetorical? By this, I mean to say that the lives of people with disabilities are affected by the way they are represented in text, and that these representations and definitions affect relations and lives of people with disability in society. So Jay will explain how otherness comes about in such rhetorical relations, and we will go on to explain the implications of normativity in two cultures.
Okay, so in this current examination, we're going to look at the rhetorical uses of disability. And one of the most remarkable or critical uses of disability in contemporary culture and throughout history has been that disability itself is used to other. It's also used to reinforce normativity, so to reinforce the centrality of the privileged position and reinforce the privilege of that position. So with this said, and I'm going to explore that in greater depth, it's also important to mention that whenever we're looking at the rhetorical action of disability, we should also remember that disability can be re-represented, that there can be subversive and critical representations of disability in the face of what we'll call normativity. So the attribution of disability is used to shore up other stigmatization. For instance, categorizations of race, ethnicity, gender, class, and sexuality have relied upon the attribution of biological inferiority. That is, those groups have been constructed as medically or biologically somehow defective or inferior over the course of history. It's important to respond to this by critiquing these constructions of disability, rather than disavowing this attribution while allowing cultural meanings of disability to go unchallenged, and therefore actually reifying them. So, for instance, instead of simply saying that a particular race, ethnic, gender, class, or sexuality group is not disabled, it's more important to say that any attribution of disability needs to be questioned and critiqued. So, disability studies at once affirms disability as a shared and positive identity. But disability studies also gives us important tools for challenging the rhetorical use of disability as a wide brush for the application of stigma, or as a tool for derogation. So disability studies as a political movement has been very much about claiming disability, owning disabled identity, and the right to define this lived experience. In the face of the medical model of disability, in which the individual was often reduced via synecdoche to the sum of her or his dysfunctional parts, disability rights has been an identity movement, a reclamation of the symbolic power of self-definition. Next, Sa'id is going to talk about some aspects of this history of disability activism and human rights.
So back to the political aspects of disability. I want to go on with Jay's explanations on how normativity is challenged through activism. What does it mean that the rights of defining one's disability identity should be kept for the individual rather than medical institutions? The answer to this question lies in who is to be responsible. While the medical model of disability views disability as a problem that belongs to the disabled individual, disability studies wants to stress on this crucial idea that disability concerns not only the person with disability, but also institutions, policies, people, organizations other than the individual. Disability activism has shown to be creative and transformative. It has shown its creativity in different forms of artistic activism to political protest. We can see disability activism in politics, in scholarship, in art, in law interrogation, and in policy reform. The other feature is that it aims at transforming perspectives and infrastructures. Disability activism, in this sense, is subversive of wrong conceptions and unequal policies. I want to stress on citizenship and disability activism by reading and explaining a brief quotation for you. I've taken this quotation from Richard Delvin and Diane Pothier's book called Toward a Critical Theory of Discitizenship. Pay attention, the title is DIS, citizenship, discitizenship, which has the connotation of depriving some people of their rights of citizenship. So the quotation goes thus. Issues of disability are not just questions of impairment, functional limitations, or enfeeblement. They are issues of social values, institutional priorities, and political will. They are questions of power, of who and what gets valued, and who and what gets marginalized. Critical disability theory goes beyond political analysis to pursue a politics of transformation. In this regard, it asks not only the traditional question of what is to be done, but also who is to do it. My purpose in reading these quotations for you is to reinforce the voice of people who are activists for their own rights, to see how these people talk about their experiences. And now another quotation from a book called Vectors of Resistance, Disabled People and the Claim to Freedom. It's written by Catherine Frazee. So the quotation is this: not only is our social positioning unfair, but the justificatory theories relied upon to account for our disadvantage are without substance. Disabled people have not been treated fairly, nor have the deprivations of our lives been natural. And so, as disabled people, we have pushed back against the forms and structures of disadvantage. We have high-roaded and horse-traded, made friends and enemies, reframed and regrouped, and always pressed on. Now, bringing together what we said about the deficit model and how it has contributed to some social mode of life for people with disability, I want to explain how this works. Jay talked about the reduction of the person to body parts as synecdoche, which is a cultural and medical suppressive perspective. Synecdoche is when in literature and language, one part of something is employed in a text to mean the whole. So one small part will be taken as the totality of something. For example, when we use the crown to mean all the kingdom and the court with its power, we have used a synecdoche. So with disability, the medical model and the traditional model see the person just through the impaired part, and because that particular body part may not be matching with the normal definition of the body, the whole existence of the person is considered as incapable. So disability activism will need to look both how disability is seen and how that perspective affects real life. Now, Jay will talk about ableism as an ideology and disability studies' challenge for it. He then talks about biopower in a Foucauldian sense to explain what it means that normativity in a society creates forms of power based on bodies and how this is also a form of repression and control.
Okay, so far we've talked about disability studies as an academic field that brings together disciplines, brings together unique perspectives, critiques constructions of disability while also providing space for reconceiving the social and cultural and rhetorical value of disability and of people with disabilities. We've also talked about how disability is used to stigmatize other groups. And there's still a lot of work to be done within disability studies and across culture to bring together different stigmatized groups and understand the ways that disability has been used to create hierarchies within society, to suppress expression, to portion out access to privilege and access to rights. So I want to talk a little bit now about a central disability studies concept called ableism, okay, and normativity. So within disability rights history and what we would call a disability rights movement that started in the middle part of the 20th century, the North American version of this movement started in the middle part of the 20th century, people with disabilities both reached out to and critiqued the role of self-defined quote-unquote normals by labeling them, quote, temporarily able-bodied. Essential to the disability rights movement was the message that disability is beautiful, that people who experience disability do not want to be cured, do not want to overcome their disabilities, and that they can and will lead very valuable lives in the face of oppression. Yet, as this activist identity evolved, and as people with disabilities and their allies took aim at society's discriminatory attitudes, exclusionary practices, and even violent and eradicative actions like sterilization, forced institutionalization, a new sense of the disabling impact of society itself emerged and took precedence. And Sa'id has already touched on this a little bit. But the protests that led up to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the United States and other similar movements in other parts of the world often centered around the message that exclusionary structures at least partially created disability. That is, if society and culture were more accessible for a wider range of bodies and minds, then people with disabilities would face fewer barriers and their lived experience would change. Another elaboration of this idea is that society might actually create barriers, in part because of a failure to imagine difference when designing structures, and those structures can be physical or cultural, but perhaps also to more consciously exclude. And this idea reveals the tangle between disability as a material lived experience and disability as a result of cultural or social constructions. To fully conceptualize disability, we must consider that disability is more than just a biomedical condition. Awareness of the social and spatial constructions of disability could allow for an even greater awareness of the uniqueness and essential difference of physiological and cognitive functions, if we think of spatial, social, ideological change in a slightly different way. That is, disability studies asks us to imagine that we could change the environment to minimize the constraining and impairing effects of intellectual and architectural structures, but also to emphasize and enable embodied differences to thrive. So, it's important to combat oppression and to eradicate violence. And living with a disability should not be made more painful or more uncomfortable, even while we're wary of the medical push for cure. But how might we also transform environments so that instead of erasing disability, we can value it, allow it to be seen and experienced as generative and essential to meeting, instead of as essentially negative and thus negatable? So in this part of the module, we're going to talk about the norm, and in particular how the idea of the norm as central to disability studies also connects to the concepts of ableism and disableism. So we might recognize the normal position when we think about it to be able-bodied, rational-minded, autonomous, polite and proprietary, and so on. In North America, the normal position is also middle to upper class, white, male, Western European, preferably American, overconfidently heterosexual, married, right-sized, and so on. These norms may change, but the presence of a desired central and privileged position persists. A simple definition of the norm is that it acts as a noun. It designates culture's desire for homogeneity, but it also acts like a verb, in that this agenda and this desire for normalcy is enforced. No person is immune from the power of norms. Norms are ubiquitous and they're fundamental. They also ensure their own enforcement. So, normativity, to ensure this enforcement, employs logics of both ableism as well as disableism. Disableism can be defined as, quote, a set of assumptions, conscious or unconscious, and practices that promote the differential or unequal treatment of people because of actual or presumed disabilities. And that quote is from Fiona Kumari Campbell. Disableism, broadly conceived, negatively constructs both the values and the material circumstances around people with disabilities. Ableism, on the other hand, positively values and makes able-bodiedness compulsory. As Tobin Siebers writes of the, quote, ideology of ability, we have constructed ability as the key feature of what constitutes being human. While disableism designates a certain group of people as non-human and portions out unequal and differential treatment to those people based on their perceived disability, ableism is what values the centrality of the privileged position. It's what continues to reinforce that privilege. So, ableism renders disability as abject, invisible, disposable, less than human, while able-bodiedness is represented as at once ideal, normal, and the mean or default. Disableism constructs disability as negative, quite a bit more directly and literally, while ableism constructs a mythical able-bodied norm, thus differentially constituting disability. So disability studies scholars then use the term normate to designate the privileged subject position of the supposedly or temporarily able-bodied individual and the culture that valorizes this position. Normalcy is used to control bodies primarily through ableism. Rosemary Garland Thompson defines the normate as, quote, the constructed identity of those who, by the way of the bodily configurations and cultural capital they assume, can step into a position of authority and wield the power it grants them. A normate culture continuously reinforces the centrality, naturality, and neutrality of this normate position. As Jacques Steicher, a key historian of disability, has pointed out, quote, figuring disability as an anomaly to be made to disappear through integration into social conformity is to represent society as a norm not to be transgressed, as a sort of universal capable of assuming through annulment all differences. This assumption, importantly, is never complete. Simply, norms need outliers. In this way, normativity also controls bodies through disableism. Cultures may demand normalcy and enforce norms, but they also mark out and marginalize those bodies and minds that do not conform to norms of ability. Though the normate position in terms of ability is in many ways drastically different, and in some ways importantly similar, to other discourses of difference, the normate position can be understood as somewhat analogous in its logics to the concepts of, for instance, whiteness or of heteronormativity. Normate cultures mark out what is not normal, employing a logic of negation, even as they demand conformity. So disability studies challenges normalcy and normativity by disrupting the default alliance of disability and deviance and challenging the idea that social imbalance can be explained by biology. This link to science and medicalization thus leads me to my next and final concept, biopower. So what is biopower? As mentioned, the term normate designates the subject position of the supposedly or temporarily able-bodied individual. The word also converts the idea of normalcy into an active process. Norms are, but they also act. We live in a culture in which norms are enforced. We live in a normative society. Of course, the normativity we now encounter is largely a product of more contemporary post-Enlightenment science in the West. We might define this medical rhetoric according to Foucault's concept of biopower. I refer here to Foucault's explanation of biopower in Volume 1 of History of Sexuality. That is, how power invests, distributes, and controls the body, and specifically how it controls entire large populations of bodies. Biopower tracks the ways that power and knowledge become transformative factors on human life. In Foucault's words, there is a, quote, tactical polyvalence of discourses that can be linked to the intensification of the body, its exploitation as an object of knowledge and an element in relations of power. So, the extension or systemization of biopower is biopolitics, the ways that definitions and valuations of life organize politics and economics. Shelley Tremaine provides a Foucauldian analysis of this process of medicalization. Quote, the modern body was created as the effect and object of medical examination. The doctor's patient had come to be treated in a way that had at one time been conceivable only with cadavers. The passivity of this object resulted from the procedure of clinical examination, where the investigative gaze fixed and crystallized as the body that which it perceived. At this point, disability now extended beyond actual impaired bodies to become an operative and essential element driving subject-object dualism. Any body subjected to the medical gaze becomes disabled to some extent, through its positioning as a passive object and through the over-signification of bodily deviation. An extension of this might be what Nicholas Rose identifies in our contemporary advanced liberal culture as, quote, an emergent form of life, characterized by vital risk and vital susceptibilities, demanding action in the vital present, in the name of vital futures to come. According to Rose, the poles of health and illness are now confused. We have new rules and regimes for relational, quote, biological citizenship, and for how we understand ourselves as somatic individuals. There are new somatic experts and expertise, and new ways to capitalize on bio-value. In short, Foucault's biopower has become a biopolitics that has been further intensified and capitalized upon. And thus we currently live in a very urgent and sophisticated culture of biologized and marketized normativity. That brings us full circle to the concept of normativity, which we have begun by defining as central to understanding disability, central to creating processes of disableism and ableism. And what we're trying to do here quite carefully is suggest to the audience ways that we might read this process of normativity as creating cultural logics that we can recognize as reaching into all of our bodies in contemporary society. So the norm now primarily allows us to see and schematize that which is abnormal, but it also involves us all in an urgent health and ability market. This perhaps contributes to the invisibility of the norm as a kind of fiction or created character, as Leonard Davis has called it. To maintain this ghostly status of the norm, we work hard to show what it's not. In this way, norms are what give excessive materiality to all bodies. Once we have a culturally determined body, it's already somewhat disabled. In our contemporary culture, then, the panic around our abnormalities multiplies. So next, because what I've just waded through is a lot of complicated theory, Sa'id is going to provide some examples, and importantly, because what I've been talking about is largely a tradition in the West, we're going to look at comparing the impact of norms, normativity, disableism, ableism, biopower across cultures.
So really talking about normativity, norms, biopower, ableism and disableism for a culture where it has not been exposed to such concepts is really difficult. So we will close this lecture at this spot. That's pretty much our introduction to disability studies. The next lecture will be multiple examples for these concepts: norm, normativity, and biopower. The examples will be taken from a Persian culture. Thanks for listening.
بهره برداری امن از موبایل و اینترنت، زن، حقوق فردی و اجتماعی، سازوکارهای جلوگیری از نقض حقوق بشر، پویشی در مفهوم دموکراسی، مروری بر پایگیری نهادهای مدنی در ایران، اندیشه‌های نوین از حقوق کارگران، آموزش خبرنگاری، حقوق شهروندی امروز و محیط زیست. توانا رایگان توانایی ما را به سمت انسان امروزین جهانی متمدن تازه می کند. برای شرکت در این کلاس ها به توانا.org بروید و با جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. از طریق فیسبوک، توییتر و شبکه یوتیوب می توانید آموزشکده توانا را دنبال کنید. توانا آموزشکده است برای جامعه مدنی ایران.